Yep. Okay. Guys, would you like to say good morning? This is Katie.
Good morning.
Hi.
Katie works at University in Adelaide and she's a researcher there. So the questions that you all put together from each of the classes were submitted and she's going to give you a bit of a presentation to answer those questions and then answer any other questions that you might have in relation to your assignments or anything else that you're interested in about the environment. Katie, can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, whenever you are ready.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Ms. Schinckel. I'm really pleased to be here and thank you for sending through your questions, everyone. So I'm Katie Irvine and I work at the University of Adelaide and also I work for the TERN group, which is the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. So I thought before I get to your questions, I might just tell you a little bit about what I do for my job. So I'm a Science Communication and Engagement Officer with this biodiversity group.
Katie, can I just interrupt you?
Sure.
Can I just double check, have you hit record?
Yes, we're recording.
Okay. Amazing, thank you.
Okay, so the TERN Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network is a national group of academics and scientists who work right across the country to collect biodiversity data. So this works in really well, I hope, with your unit of work that you're doing on habitats and biodiversity and ecosystems. So just briefly to tell you about what we do, we have three actually levels of research that we look at. So we work at the landscape scale, which is right across the country. And to do this, mostly we use satellite and GIS information so that we can look at really big picture landscape questions about ecosystem change and monitoring what's going on across our country in the environment. We also work at a surveillance scale. So that means we have a team of field biologists, and this is actually the group that I work in. We have a team who go right out across Australia every year, 2 weeks on and then 2 weeks home for most of the year. And they take a couple of four-wheel drives and some trailers and they drive out to plots right across the country. And so you can see those green triangles on the map there. They're our plots that we have, so you can see they're really widely spread across the country. A plot is 1 hectare, so 100 metres by 100 metres, and in that area we collect all the information we can about vegetation and soils. And in the future we'll be also looking at the fauna, so doing some monitoring of the animals there as well. So the kinds of information we're looking at is collecting voucher specimens of all the plants to go in the herbariums around the country. We take genetic samples, we dig a 1 metre by 1 metre soil pit so we can look at the physical qualities of the soil, but we also take some samples so that people can look at the structural but also the genetics, so animals and plants leave behind their genetic imprints in the soil. So the idea really is to collect this big library of data and samples, and we make all of that freely available to the research and land management community in Australia. And then the third level of monitoring that we do is called processes, and we have what they call super sites. So there's one in this picture behind me, that's the Robson Creek super site up on the Atherton Tablelands. And at a super site we have a canopy crane, and you can see that in a few of the pictures around the map of Australia there. And a canopy crane is designed to mostly measure abiotic factors, so the carbon flux and the different gases that are exchanged around the forest. So you can see on the map the orange squares, that's where we have our super sites. So they're one in every state and a few down in the southeast corner and a few in Queensland. So we're looking at all different sorts of habitat from the arid zones and then right through the tropical rainforests and the cooler rainforests. We also look at microclimate. So there are weather stations that measure changes in wind and temperature and that kind of thing really regularly, so we can keep a close eye on changes in climate in that way. And then also at those sites, we intensively measure plants and animals. I think I'll just keep talking and then we might have a few breaks for questions, if that's okay. Does that work okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so this is just another slide to summarise what we do at TERN. So we measure information about the ecosystems, about land and terrain, also carbon and water, and then the biodiversity, which is what you guys are particularly interested in for this unit of work. And so the reason we do this at TERN, the reason we have all of these scientists and field biologists and software engineers and research and development people in this group is so that we can provide data and samples to researchers across Australia so that they can answer some major questions that we have as scientists, but also that the government would like to know. So these questions include how are ecosystems responding to environmental pressures? So, you know, things that you would have heard about, no doubt, are climate change, and then the bushfires recently are a topic that we're keeping an eye on. And so it's really important to have the baseline data, so to have monitored all these different ecosystems to know how things looked before, so that when there is change, we can work out where the change is and potentially look at what is causing the change and then how can we manage it. So we can also use modelling, so computer modelling, to predict what the change might look like into the future, particularly with climate change, and that's where the satellite imagery and the really broad landscape scale monitoring comes in. So we're looking at abiotic factors as well, so carbon stock, water, obviously biodiversity is tied in closely with the soils, water, and the vegetation. So how are they responding to change? And then how can we use the information we have to apply to management? And finally, we look at how resilient soil health, nutrient cycling, the fire that I mentioned, clean water, pollination, and carbon sequestration, which I'm not sure if you guys have covered that, but that's really closely tied to climate change, whether we can keep that carbon down here in the soils and the plants rather than going into the atmosphere. And then ecosystem services, which ties in nicely with some of the questions you guys asked, and that I will answer in a minute. I just wanted to mention this pack we put together a few months ago. So when the first COVID lockdown happened, we had a few teachers in Queensland, actually. They were year 11, 12 teachers, but I think this would apply to most high school classes for biology. Teachers contacted us and said, well, we can't actually go out in the field and do the field work we'd planned for our class. So can we have access to your information, so your data, so that we can do some of the exercises in class that we plan to do? So we put together an Excel spreadsheet that has a lot of information. So about our 750 sites. Lots of data in there about all the plant species that have been found, and also some soil information and information about the weather and environment. And so you can do some statistics on that if you want to, or there's also within the data pack a lot of information about, just to give ideas, I guess, on what kind of work you might like to do to interrogate that data. So yeah, you can find that there on the TERN website. And another resource I thought might be of interest, it's quite a long interview, 26 minutes, but ABC Radio a couple of years ago went out to this station that's in the picture behind me and interviewed one of the scientists out there. And it's just a really interesting interview where they climb up the canopy tower, which is really, it's up above the tree line. So I think it's about 50 metres high. And they talk about all the different things they monitor there at that site. So that's quite a good resource too. Okay, so that's the end of my talk about TERN and what we do. You can see there's a large number of groups involved, quite a few of the universities, CSIRO, and then quite a few government bodies involved in this work. So this program's been running for about 10 years now, and we're looking to the future just to get more and more involved in monitoring the environment and reporting and trying to manage the potentially negative effects of change. Did you want to have any questions at this point?
Anyone got any questions, guys? No.
Okay. All right, so to your questions, the first one I have is, why is biodiversity important? And it's such a great question, and it kind of is overarching across everything that I'm going to talk about today. So I thought we would deal with that one first. Biodiversity is incredibly important, and I've got 5 main points here to talk about the reason it's so. So firstly, biodiversity is very important to humans. We talk about it in terms of ecosystem services. So that's all the ways we as humans rely on ecosystems for our day-to-day life. They might sound obvious, but you can delve much deeper into each of these topics if you're particularly interested in them. But we do rely on clean water, which is related to biodiversity that grows along waterways. Pollination is a huge one. There are lots of projects going on looking at bees in particular. You might have heard about that on the news. We rely on often insects, but pollinators of all kinds to set crops. So, for example, almonds and canola and a lot of their fruits like apples and pears must be pollinated before they can set fruit. So there's all those industries, multi-billion-dollar industries, reliant on animals to be able to get their crops. So that leads us into food. Healthy soil is incredibly important for growing food. We need oxygen, which is reliant on healthy ecosystems to photosynthesize and produce that. And avoiding disease is a big one. We need healthy biodiversity and everything to be in balance. And an example of that is COVID-19, which scientists believe has come from the wildlife trade and unhealthy relationships between humans and biodiversity. Secondly, biodiversity is important for wildlife. So I would look at that in 3 levels. Firstly, you need genetic diversity for wildlife to be healthy. That's within a species. So making sure that we have plenty of individuals who are genetically diverse within that species so that we don't get bottlenecks or genetic mutations and issues when populations get too small. And we can see that sometimes with endangered species, and then they have to be managed really closely. We also need species diversity within an environment, and that just means keeping as many species as possible, plants and animals and fungi, in a certain habitat to ensure that we have a healthy ecosystem. And then ecosystems. So there are many bioregions, for example, within Australia. So that's a habitat type, and within each ecosystem or habitat type, we have a balance between all of the life forms and the abiotic factors. And economy is a really important thing to consider, and that does tie back into ecosystem services. Biodiversity is incredibly important for the global economy. I just found these stats online. So biological resources provide 40% of the world's economy, and also in developing regions, it's more like 80% of the regional economy is dependent on biodiversity. When we have healthy biodiversity, it can buffer the effects of climate change. For example, on a really hot day, if you are around some green space, we look at urban biodiversity. It can be a way to make people more comfortable, but also at a big picture level, it's really important to keep as much biodiversity, as much habitat as possible for that carbon sequestration as well. The last point is, it kind of ties into question 2 there as well. How does knowledge about biodiversity make us a better society? Biodiversity is incredibly important for culture and identity right across the world. going out into nature is really important for health and well-being. So we use biodiversity for recreation. Religion, biodiversity is tied in quite closely to most religions. And then also national identity. For example, we have animals on our coat of arms, and people do identify with certain species, I guess. So like koalas, we're quite closely tied with and we feel very strongly about in Australia. The next question is, how do different types of plants affect a habitat? That's probably one I'll leave with you guys to research further if you're interested, but I would suggest to think about the life history of the plants. So, for example, are they large trees or tiny herbs? And think about how species interact together. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute when we talk about the bird questions that you have. But, you know, certain animals need plants for their shelter or for their food, that kind of thing. This is a really interesting question about which countries have the healthiest habitats. You could go a lot of ways with answering this question, but the rabbit hole I went down when I had a look online for you was that bottom blogger there, the conservation.org, and they were talking about healthy habitats in terms of how they affect the economy of a country, and they were looking at African countries and saying that within Africa, the countries that have the healthiest habitats are the ones who can see the benefit to the economy of having good biodiversity and healthy habitats. For example, tourism, if people can see, and this happens in Australia too, if people can see that there is an advantage to having a healthy habitat for tourists to come and see, then that definitely will impact, and those countries or those areas of a country will be preserved, which is really important, that there's some motivators and economic reasons for people to protect areas. So this is one of my favourite topics to talk about, is orchids. So thank you for those questions that people sent in. I'm working on a project at the moment called Wild Orchid Watch, and it's a citizen science project. You guys have some really great citizen science projects in Queensland too. But this one is a national project, and we are asking people to download an app that we have created called Wild Orchid Watch, and then to take photos of Australia's native orchids when they see them out in the bush. So the question about whether orchids are rare is a good question. We have many species of orchids. We have 1,700 or 1,800 of native orchids in Australia. And they range from the epiphytes that you see right up the east coast of Australia and across the north. So those are the orchids that grow up in trees, or they can grow on rocks. And then down south, we only have the terrestrial orchids that grow in the soil and are quite tiny, like the one in the picture here. That scale card, each little black line is only 1 centimetre. And internationally, we have 30,000 species of orchids. So it's one of the most speciose families of flowering plants. But having said that, there are many rare species within that diversity, and that's due to loss of habitat around the world. And in Australia, we have suffered a large loss of orchid species. And we have many threatened species of orchids, which has led us to this project where we are asking people within the community to help us map the orchids around Australia. So that's our website, wildorchidwatch.org, and we are a project within iNaturalist, which is an incredible international citizen science platform for sharing information about plants, animals and fungi. So that's really worth having a look at iNaturalist too. Just quickly to tell you about the Wild Orchid Watch project. So it's been a 3-year project, and we set that up with some software developers who work at TERN, so that we could produce our own app. We also have ecologists who help us set the methods, which means making sure that the information we're asking the general public to collect is actually going to be useful for scientists because this information will be openly available for research and for land management. The resource is really important to the community. So that's kind of, it's the website and it's all the social media that's attached. And it's also the opportunity for people to interact with each other about the observations they've made. So people will take a photo of an orchid and put in some habitat information that we ask them to do. But then other members of the public can hop on the website and identify the species. Because you can imagine when there's 1,700 species, they're quite hard to learn. So we have some amazing amateur naturalists who do the job for us of identifying all those species. So yeah, people take out their smartphone, take photos of the orchids and then upload them, and then that data can be shared to research scientists and land managers. Okay, so I heard that you guys are doing quite a bit of work on birds. And we have these questions that you've asked about birds. I found the BirdLife Australia Birds in Backyards website to be really helpful. I think you'll find pretty much everything you need on there. But just to help you out, we'll just go through these questions quickly. So what is an effective method to increase the amount of native birds in a habitat? It's all about making that habitat as complex as possible. What has happened largely in urban areas around Australia is we have simplified habitat, and in farmland as well. So we've taken out a lot of the complexity. So that means the leaf litter and the sticks and branches and low growing plants and shrubs, ground covers, all of that lower level really important habitat for birds is missing in a lot of our urban parks and suburban parks and farmland. And that's why we've lost quite a few species of the small honeyeaters and the insectivorous and granivorous birds. So you do still see many of the larger birds which have done fine, like the galahs and the magpies and birds like that are okay without that kind of complexity. But to increase the number of species, we really need to put back a lot of that complex habitat. So to attract native birds to an area, definitely increase habitat. Keep cats away. That's a huge issue. We lose a lot of small birds to cats, so feral cat and also household cats. So if cats can be kept, and dogs too, can be kept inside, that's great. Other things you can do for native birds is put up bird boxes. So a lot of birds like parrots and owls rely on hollows to nest in, and a lot of our old hollow bearing trees have been removed from the environment. So I think there's a fact sheet on that Birds in Backyards website where you can find out about bird boxes. And fresh, clean, cool water is really important over summer for birds. So a lot of people have success with putting out a bird bath and keeping that clean and filled up for birds. They really appreciate that. And that actually needs to be in amongst native vegetation too. So birds won't use a bird bath out in the open because they'll be worried about predation. But if you can have that tucked in near some native vegetation, that will really help. Okay, small things we can do to positively impact our environment. The things I've just described about bird habitat, that applies to all kinds of animals. So you can create habitat for lizards and skinks by just, again, putting in some of that leaf litter and fallen trees like branches and that kind of thing, and some basking rocks. Frogs, you can create a wetland or even just a small pond to bring frogs into your in your backyard or on a bush block. There's so much. That's the big question. There's so much more. So you could talk about, removing plastics from the environment, or cutting down your plastics use is another big thing you can do. Yeah, that's a big question. There's a lot online, so definitely have a look online about that. If you're looking for an animal or plant, how do you know where to start searching for it? I've included a link here to the Atlas of Living Australia, which is a really great resource. There's a lot of citizen science information on there, but also museums and herbariums and professional scientists, their data ends up there too. So it's just a huge database, including maps and photos of all Australia's plants, animals and fungi. So that would be a great place to start, because you can just see where your species of interest is on a map. And iNaturalist also has that same feature. When you get to the point of, if you're actually going to do a study on a certain species, that would be when you would start doing surveys. So for example, for birds, you could use eBird or the Bird Data app, and there are citizen scientists, people out using those apps to run surveys. So for example, walking for 20 minutes in a 2-hectare area and then just recording all the species of birds they hear or see. For frogs and bats, we would probably put out audio recorders and work out what species were in an area. For mammals, we might do some trapping, put out pitfall traps or cage traps to find out what is in an area. But obviously that's with a lot of planning and permits. And then for a plant, it's the same with the surveying. So for example, the 1-hectare plots that we have over 750 of across Australia for TERN, we have standardised methods, which is just walking up and down set grids within those plots and recording what species are there and the structure of that habitat. Okay, I think these are the last questions. How can we introduce a wide variety of plants when there are contradicting abiotic factors? That's a really interesting question. I suppose when you are reintroducing plants to an area, you would usually think about what used to grow in that area. So if you could get a plant species list, then you would look at putting back the same species that were there. That's really quite important. So they're called endemic species. And often people will get the seeds of plants from nearby if there's an existing conservation park or something like that, or private land that's got existing habitat there, and try and grow species that have that same genetic structure as was there originally. Having said that, abiotic factors are changing. So in terms of climate change, some areas that were once maybe a bit cooler and had more regular rainfall are now more often suffering from drought or higher temperatures and less rain. So then scientists are actually doing quite a few studies at the moment looking at how to change the makeup of plants in an area to be able to cope into the future with that changing climate. So there's some really interesting studies around that. The next question is, do different plant species give off different amounts of oxygen? To investigate that question, I would suggest that you look at the photosynthetic rates, and the answer is yes, and that is dependent on the photosynthetic process. So the chlorophyll in a leaf, the amount of light available to it, the amount of water available, and then the plant structure, so how the chlorophyll sits within the leaf. That all will affect the photosynthesis and therefore the amount of oxygen that the plant will release. And lastly, a question about wombat poo. This was in the media quite a bit a couple of years ago. The media loved this, and I did include a link to a website where they interview a scientist who was working on looking at this question of square wombat poo. Briefly, the findings so far have been that they think it's to do with the shape of the intestine of a wombat. Wombats have really long intestines relative to their size compared to humans, for example. And so they think it's this banding of the muscles within the intestines that shapes the poo into these funny square shapes. And also the fact that they have a really high fibre, low water diet. It's just a different way of processing food. But yeah, I saw some really funny stuff online. For example, they were saying people had a theory that maybe wombats did square poo so they could pile them up in nice tall piles, which is quite odd, and I'm pretty sure that's not why. But thank you for that question. Okay, one more question. What is the most interesting project you've ever worked on? So I love the work I'm doing at the moment, the orchids and monitoring around Australia, but for my PhD at James Cook Uni in Cairns, I worked on green ringtail possums, which are just super cute animals. And I was looking at effects of climate change on their diet. So this study was almost 15 years ago now, but it's still an issue, an ongoing issue, and probably increasing in severity, I would imagine. But the issue we were looking at is the diet of possums is just leaves, so they're called folivores. And leaves are protected by plants by using toxins or plant secondary metabolites. And so it's like an evolutionary arms race where the plant tries to protect itself from folivory and the possum needs to adapt to those toxins so it can continue to eat and survive. But with a warmer, drier climate, it really is putting pressure on these possums because they have trouble metabolizing the toxins in their diet if they can't get enough water. So we found in this study that the possums were choosing plant species in their diet, but also individual trees within species that had lower amounts of some toxins, for example, cyanide, which really does suggest that they are being put under pressure by these toxins. And that's the end of my talk. Were there any questions?
Anyone have any further questions? No? Thank you, Katie. That was fantastic, particularly the part around how to increase more native birds. I think the students now should have plenty of recommendations on what they can add to their little summary video on how we can encourage more native birds and animals back into the school grounds.
Great.
All right, brilliant. Can we thank Katie for her time this morning, guys?
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll speak to you again soon.
Yeah, talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.